Good evening again. It is a delight to be here on the last panel. As Kate said, we are looking at the intersection of research, organizing, and accountability. As you've seen throughout the night, we have a lot of work to do, right? And while you can spend some cozy time with the algorithm in the evening, which may be your cup of tea, that's not going to give you the whole picture about the social implications and the social role of these systems. So this really speaks to the need to join those on-the-ground experiences, the people on the front lines living, the Medicaid cuts, living the impacts of these systems, with an understanding of how these systems are designed and the intention of these systems. So I am just delighted to be here with two people who I think really exemplify this kind of socially engaged work. Lucy Suchman is a pioneering researcher. We mentioned her in the intro, one of the architects of human-computer interaction. She spent 20 years at Xerox PARC, where you really defined that field and focused on the context of the deployment of technical systems, where kind of humans met machines. Her recent work looks at autonomous weapons and the danger of an AI-enabled military, and it's engaged with organizing around those topics. I am also really delighted to be joined by our own Rashida Richardson. Rashida is AI Now's Director of Policy Research, and she joins us from the ACLU, where she's done a lot of work looking at the lived experiences of these systems and figuring out ways to empower activists, organizers, and civil society leaders to push back against some of the problems that these systems cause. So it is great to be with you. And before we get started with questions, I just want to remind you, hashtag AINow2018, that's where questions go. It's up there. We'll be taking one of your questions at the end of this panel. And with that, Lucy, I would love to invite you to get us started. Your work, as I mentioned, looked at the context of sort of human interactions with these systems. Where did the best laid code go wrong when it meets the fresh air? And that really shaped a field of understanding, like, how do we live amongst these systems? What lessons do you think we can kind of learn from your approaches as we strive to create better accountability on the ground?
Okay, well, first of all, thanks to Kate and Meredith and AI Now, and also to all of you. This has been a marathon session, and it's fabulous that you're still with us. So, I mean, Meredith, you characterized me as an architect of HCI. I mean, I was a very accidental researcher in the area of human-computer interaction, artificial intelligence, robotics, cognitive science, because I went to Xerox PARC first in 1978 as a PhD student in anthropology. It would be way too long a story to tell you how I happened to end up there. But it was at one of the moments of AI's ascendance, particularly the planning versions of AI and robotics, expert systems, but also the idea of interactive computing. And I was really intrigued by the idea of intelligence and interactivity as they were being reworked through a kind of computational imaginary there. And I guess a lot of my work since then has been about trying to articulate both the incredibly intimate relations that we have with our machines, but also the differences that matter between humans and machines. And I've been, in that context, tracking developments in AI and robotics. And I guess for me, there's a really important distinction between projects in humanoid robotics, which are attempting to create machines in the image of usually the individual autonomous human subject, and developments more recently that are really tied to, Moore's law is always cited as the thing that's going to take us inevitably to the singularity, but actually Moore's law is really only about speed, storage capacity, and I think it's the speed of computation, the storage capacity that's available, and the extent of networking, which is made the real difference. So, and there we're talking about data analytics and a lot of the things we've been talking about tonight. When we come to humanoid robotics, AI and robotics, which I've been tracking quite carefully, I would argue that practically no progress has been made. And I think the reason for that is the difficulty of actually incorporating into technologies what we think of as, well, basically knowing what's going on around you. So this idea of context, which isn't, that we're in a container and we have to kind of recognize it, but it's something that we are actively and in an ongoing dynamic way co-creating together. And that sense of interactivity continues to escape projects in AI and robotics. And maybe if we come back to talk about weapon systems, I think that's extremely consequential. I've begun to sort of engage with what in the military is referred to as situational awareness, absolutely fundamental to, in particular, all military operations presuppose the identification of a legitimate target, of the enemy. And that's the place where these problems that we've been talking about, that's the thread, I think, that connects the systems that we've been engaging with. Who is being identified as an imminent threat, and on what grounds, basically?
Yeah, I mean, I think this gets to a real heart of the question when kind of only one party, the human party, in a sort of human-machine interaction has situational awareness. What is accountability? And Rashida, I would love to turn to you there because obviously that's going to require a lot of different perspectives, and you have worn a lot of different hats. You come to AI now from the ACLU. You have been deeply engaged in social justice advocacy work, and now you're working on AI research around policy issues that relate to the deployment of these systems. So how do you see the joining of these perspectives, the sort of movements and the research being done successfully, given that you've occupied so many of these positions?
So a lot of what we're talking about tonight is the application of technical systems to really complex and sensitive social, political, and economic issues. So I think there's this temptation to treat researchers and advocates as separate, not collaborative, but they both have something to bring to the table, and neither should be treated as a blank slate that needs to be taught something. So I think there's a few things to keep in mind with both groups, and I'll end with what they can actually each do. The first is I think it's important for both, and I'll say we because I guess I wear both hats, for us to be both introspective and honest about what we know and what we don't know, because I think that there are a lot of sort of blind spots and inherent biases that we have from our individual positions in relation to power and privilege that lead to a lot of the unknowns, but no one wants to really be honest about that or open to criticism. And I also think that all of the work, whether it's research or advocacy, needs to be grounded in reality. I think both Kevin's panel and the panel before that showed that the harms and consequences of what these issues that we're talking about are very real and they impact real people. And I think there's also a temptation to think about these issues only theoretically, and that's extremely harmful right now in our socio-political moment. So sort of to break apart the groups, I think in research it needs to be empirical, interdisciplinary, and collaborative in order to inform integrated advocacy and organizing that is also collaborative and diverse.
That's a great answer. And I know, we're seeing a lot of movements sort of push back against, we've met a lot of people who are pushing back against sort of instances of harm that happen to individuals around these systems. And we're also seeing kind of tech worker organizing. That's something that I have been sort of involved in contributing my research to. And that, Lucy, I know you have been sort of, engaged in as well. But I would love to sort of, go back to history a little bit, right? Because while this recent wave of kind of, concerned ethical employees at big tech companies has been fairly surprising and heartening to many of us, It's not the first, and I would love for you to tell us a little bit about the Computer Professionals for Social Responsibility, which can be seen as a bit of a predecessor to what we're seeing now, and what lessons that, that movement, that organization that you helped found might have for people who are trying to advocate for similar issues.
Yeah, sure. I mentioned I first went to Xerox's Palo Alto Research Center in 1978, and in 1981, an electrical engineer, computer scientist named Severo Ornstein sent out a message to an email list called anti-war. It's called anti-war up arrow because we used up arrows to differentiate distribution lists from individual persons. So he sent out this message to anti-war up arrow. And basically, Severo had worked on the SAGE system. So this is the semi-autonomous ground environment that was developed from basically 1950 to 1980. So this was the NORAD early warning system against incoming Soviet missiles during the Cold War. And Severo had worked on SAGE, and he was looking at what was happening in the development of launch on warning systems within nuclear weapons systems. And he was tremendously concerned about launch on warning. It was very destabilizing in terms of the sort of so-called logics of mutually assured destruction. So it was really crucial in that respect, but also based on what he knew from having worked on the SAGE system, he saw how dangerous this kind of hair trigger warning system was, how inherently unreliable, and there were arguments about the inherent unreliability of that system, which carried forward to our situation today. So he, a few years later, we founded Computer Professionals for Social Responsibility with people at Park, people at Stanford, a sort of growing network of people, and basically tried to make the technical arguments for the inherent dangers and unreliabilities of launch on warning. And interestingly, in 1983, there was a kind of companion. This was Ronald Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, the so-called Star Wars program, and of course now we have Jedi, so we've returned to the sequel. So there was, but there was a companion to Star Wars, which was called the Strategic Computing Initiative, which was basically an AI initiative with something for each of the branches of the armed services. And with Severo and Brian Smith, I wrote a piece for the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists where we did a critique of these of the Strategic Computing Initiative, which I think, and that was published in 1983. I think it could pretty well be recycled, and it would still apply.
Sadly.
Yeah.
I would love to stay on this with you for a moment, Lucy. Just from a practical perspective, I'm sure there are people in the audience who work for some of these companies who are, personally and collectively confronting these issues. What worked?
Yeah.
And what would you advise these people to do who are, oftentimes really feeling these tensions in themselves and within their employer?
Right. Well, one issue here is that our actions were not directed at Xerox itself. So we were working from our base in a research center with very strong ties to universities, and that's where I think the academy and industry in those networks were very closely joined. So we weren't threatening our employer directly. That's a really important issue. But it was, I think, very much through the alliance with the academic networks that really grew, and it is really heartening to see what's happening with the tech workers and with Google and your incredibly important work in relation to the organizing against Project Maven, and then I was part of a group who put together a kind of academic scientist letter in support of that effort. So those coalitions, I think, are great. And of course, we didn't really have the kind of network-based organizing tools. We had email lists, and that was about it. So the advent of the web, the way that things now travel from a letter that then gets posted on the web, that gets picked up by the media, that turns into an online op-ed. That's really accelerated and facilitated that as well.
Yeah. And I mean, I think in the case of, Maven and other issues, especially for people within the tech industry, they have kind of visibility into what these are. And I know, Rashida, a lot of your work is kind of grappling with systems that are sort of invisible by design. We talked about the black boxes on black boxes, right? These are sort of inscrutable, but still deeply, powerfully affecting people's lives. And I would love your insights on, how do you do work around those systems, and how do you marshal the communities who can sort of, scope their many dimensions?
Yeah, so the transparency, and I would also add accountability into that. Work is hard, and it's in part because there's so much that we don't know. So one way that we engage in the work is working with researchers and advocates from all over, because the issues really vary by jurisdiction. So there are black boxes everywhere, but how invisible and how much we know may vary based on your local laws or procurement processes. So one of the issues is just trying to understand what's going on. And then I think as far as strategy and solutions, that very much needs to be informed by the local context. So in that work, I'll use New York as an example, not only because it's our own hometown, but because it's a good example. But here in your intro with Kate, you guys mentioned the New York City task force that's looking at government use of automated decision systems. And we've been involved in that work from getting the legislation passed through to when the task force was announced. But just so the audience has an understanding of what we're talking about, the task force has to write a report by the end of next year with recommendations on a number of issues, like what should the public actually know about where and how these systems are being used, if a group or an individual is harmed, what should redress look like, and then more technical questions like how can we archive these systems, especially given that municipal budgets are not ever expanding. So in that work, we constantly met, and I think a common stream both within government and within civil society is that this is an important issue. But I think everyone kind of struggled with how do you actually address these questions? And I don't want to sort of fall into the let's punt to the task force until they can figure it out in December of 2019. So what we ended up doing is trying to do some of that hard research and work this summer and engaging people from researchers to the average New Yorkers, like I just talked to my family or people on the train, about these issues, and trying to figure out like what exactly should the redress standard be? What should these procedures be? And let's at least start the conversation. It's possible we could be wrong, but if we're not at least grappling with what could work and what doesn't work, then we're not going to get very far a year from now. So that process was very helpful, and then it also allowed us to engage others. So we listed a group of both individuals and organizational experts for the task force to use, and that was a useful process because even though we did list, I think, like 3 pages of people, I remember one person pointing out like, hey, under child welfare, you listed a lot of great lawyers and people who understand family law, but you have no one representing parents' voices. And that was just an omission because you only know who's within your network. So it was a good opportunity to get more voices at the table and also more perspectives and understanding what is actually going on here and what's the best way to address it.
Yeah. I mean, what was the most sort of illuminating insight you got from that process? Is there something someone told you that you just would not have come up with if you hadn't engaged sort of across a coalition?
I think it was revealing to me that like no one really has the right answer, and I'll give one example. Often to try to figure out the redress issue that I'm mentioning, the place to look is at legal theories on disparate impact. And there's a lot of different theories on that, and unfortunately US law is kind of regressive, so none of the prevailing ones are the ones I would choose. Keeping that in mind and trying to be idealistic, I just talked to some of the prevailing standards are under housing discrimination laws, so the HUD standard, and others are in employment law, the EEOC standards. And I talked to employment lawyers and housing lawyers, and I was like, what don't you like about this standard? And for some of them, they were like, we're so used to working in regressive frameworks that it's hard to imagine alternatives. And I think that was the struggle in the process of like, how do I imagine a solution that's not within the oppressive society that I live in? And the answer is, I don't really know, but we tried. And I think it's forcing that conversation and trying to imagine the alternatives and sort of being resistant to the idea of like, that's not practical as a good counter argument.
Yes, I love that point, and I think it is a great on-ramp to sort of return to the topic of autonomous weapons, which are kind of this negative example of, you know, the excesses and dangers of these technologies. And, you know, Lucy, you've worked so much on this issue. You've, you know, pushed back against autonomous weapons. You've organized against them. You've researched them. And I would love you to kind of connect the issue of, you know, rejecting or holding these systems accountable with sort of the broader issues of accountability. Like, what lessons can we learn from really, you know, fighting against this very negative and very, you know, frightening perspective? And, you know, Rashida's term, the sort of like the terms of the oppressive society are kind of wrapped into the development of these systems.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't talked a whole lot about militarism tonight, interestingly, but of course, you know, all these things are incredibly joined up. And, you know, to me, I think it was Philip Alston who mentioned the us-them. You know, this is about, you know, as I said, a lot of the ways in which technology has been framed as the avenue for security, the possibility of a sort of perfect defensive system, which was the Star Wars vision, fantasy, is now, I mentioned Jedi before, and I should have said that's the Joint Enterprise Defense Infrastructure, which is the current incarnation of the dream of a perfectly integrated global information network that will join up all of the U.S. military operations around the world, of which there, as you know, are many, an overwhelming number. So this, and the premise that these systems are going to give us the ability to discriminate between us and them, the good guys and bad guys, who constitutes a threat. I think that's a thread that runs through all of the issues of algorithmic identification, sorting, social sorting, categorization, classification, discrimination that we've been talking about. And in the case of the lethal autonomous weapon systems, the idea is this is an issue that's being debated at the UN in the context of what's called the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons. These are weapons that are considered to be indiscriminate. Landmines would be an example, and the critical functions that have been identified by the International Committee for the Red Cross and others who are campaigning around this are target identification and the initiation of attack. So the idea is that we should ban the automation of those two critical functions. We should not create weapons where we think we have delegated to the weapon system sufficient discriminatory capacities that it can identify who constitutes an imminent threat. And to me, that's directly tied to the Project Maven work, because the idea of Maven, Project Maven basically is responsive to the vast network of drone surveillance that the US military has created, which is producing orders of video footage that are completely unusable because of their massive size. And so the idea is that there will be a kind of triage, we heard that word before, a kind of algorithmic automation of the first pass of analysis of this video footage, that it will, that there will be certain classes, certain categories of objects, vehicles, buildings, persons we can imagine, or configurations of persons, that will then lead to the claim is the handing off of those things then to human analysts. And that this will make the whole system more efficient. But those of us who've been following the drone the US drone program, and again, Philip Alston has played a really crucial role here, know that the so-called precision of those systems is a complete fallacy. That there's evidence that, for example, in the U.S. Drone program in Pakistan from about 2006 to 2014, about 75% of the people killed by that program, we don't know who they were. And about another 20% were positively identified as women or children, and therefore civilians. And there's a 5% remainder who are the people who we actually know who was killed, and there's an argument that they were a legitimate target. So we're talking about a massively inaccurate program that the proposal now is to automate. Really bad idea.
Yeah.
And I think the consistent thread, the consistent thread that we're talking about all the entire evening is profiling. Profiling of various kinds, the crudest forms of profiling that are the basis for these purportedly, cutting edge technological systems. They're informed by the absolutely crudest and in many cases most long-standing forms of discriminatory stereotyping that we've had with us for a very long time.
But they're so glossy. Rashida, in response to that, I would love to just pass it to you. So how do we empower the profiled, the people targeted, the people on the other end of these systems to push back?
Well, I think there's a tendency to think that people don't understand these issues because AI is super technical and beyond understanding, but I think most people, especially those who are affected not only by these systems, but the prior sort of forms of these systems, so government systems with humans making biased decisions, understand the problem. So I think both being open to the fact that people actually could know the solutions to their own problems and respecting the intelligence, experience, and expertise of everyone, so that way they can engage and have a place at the table to come up with solutions.
Yeah. So I just pulled a question from the audience here, and I would love both of your thoughts on this. I will start with Lucy. So what does it mean to organize tech workers who already have so much privilege? Are people actually putting their jobs on the line?
Okay, great. Great question. First of all, I think part of my response to that would be not all tech workers have a lot of privilege. If we include among tech workers the people who Virginia Eubanks was talking about, who the Tech Workers Coalition incorporates many of those people. So if we treat tech workers really broadly, then they're a highly heterogeneous group. I do think it's a legitimate question. I think some tech workers who are speaking out are risking their jobs. Now, you could argue that they're relatively well positioned to go and find other jobs. So then of course, I think we all risk in proportion to the amount of privilege or precarity that we have otherwise in life. And so, I think it's a legitimate question, but I also think, again, that there are some really interesting possibilities for the mobilization of a coalition of workers inside big tech companies.
So I think tech workers are in a unique position to have influence, but I also am hesitant to put all of my faith in the tech community as the leaders of some resistance, because if we're being honest about how homogenous the dominant group is that is influencing the way these tools are being developed, they don't understand, and this is we all don't understand a lot, which was in my first response, but like, they don't understand the history of a lot of the issues that they're working in, or the social, political, and economic context of the way that the tools that they're creating will be implemented. So I think some of this advocacy is great because you have people who are in higher positions of power and have higher access to privilege and power that can sort of move the ball forward or move it in some direction. But I don't want to think that is sort of what's going to change things. I think it needs to come from everyone else who's actually affected by these systems and those who actually bring other perspectives from the table. I don't think it's any one group that's going to result in any revolutionary change is what we really need. So it needs to, I think it's also upon the tech workers to realize they have certain power and influence, but they're not the ones that should be deciding what is ethical, what is not, what is moral, what's not.
Yeah, hard agree. I think with that, we're going to wrap it up. Thank you so much. That was just lovely to have you.